That day, the morning dawned more perfectly than any Christmas card illustrations. Several inches of fresh, pure, white snow dusted every yard and rooftop, and the air was crisp and cold. Multiple rows of icicles twinkled silver in the mild sunlight. I didn't remember last year being nearly so picturesque, though if it had been, my bleak and unpleasant mindset from that time may have warped my memories. How could I imagine that in such a short span of time my life would change so drastically for the better, that I would be pulled out of that grey mode of monotonous existence to a warmth of real living, and the one who had hooked me and reeled me into the light, the one responsible for such a positive change in my life, was currently kneeling across the living room. She was carefully unwrapping building after building of a fragile ceramic Christmas village set. It was one of the many decorations that she had inherited, taken off her parents' hands, or bought her own over the years. She was always a Christmas decoration enthusiast. As soon as the seasonal changeover in the stores occurred, she had taken me shopping for decorations that were to be ours, and ours alone. I had never thought that spending so much time in the overly sparkling, flouncy Christmas ornament aisle would have been such an enjoyable experience. But then again, I'd come to find that she made everything enjoyable. Something as menial as filling paperwork could be made whimsical by her presence. So seeing her smile and point out all the novelty ornaments, as well as marvel at the intricate traditional ones, was so sweet that it was worth any humiliation I might have felt being the guy dragged into that aisle. She had been right, after all. I felt an unexpected sense of pride and ownership, knowing that our small pile of new decorations was being included in such a time-honored tradition, that the bright and cheery ornaments and baubles we had picked out together would now be displayed alongside those from her grandmother and her mother, as well as her own collection. It was such an insignificant thing, really, but I was feeling strangely sentimental. A year ago, I would never thought that something like a little stroll angel, or even that cheesy ceramic Christmas village, was precious because of whom they belonged to. The slightly age-worn angel had been her grandmother's, and the ceramic village was from her own mother's collection. She told me the entire story of when she was a child, and her mother brought it home from the store in a glossy cardboard box. She still remembered the custom-cut styrofoam for each little piece of the collection. Memories like that were so incredibly linked to the object in question that it imbued it with significance. Personally, I had no such memories associated with any objects, whereas she had an ideal, rosy upbringing. Mine was just the opposite. There was just a void in my heart, whereas most children usually stored happy, cheerful memories of the holiday season with good food and presents. But my less than happy past was made so much easier to bear once I met her. Her joy for every occasion to gather and celebrate was infectious, and slowly, bit by bit, she had filled the cold hollow in my heart with love, warmth, and wonder. Something as simple as decorating for Christmas was more than a task for her. It was a special and meaningful tradition that she was determined to make me a part of, like everything else in her life. She had dragged me so far out of my comfort zone that I eventually realized that it had not been a comfort zone to begin with, so much as a prison where I'd isolate myself from feeling anything at all. It had hurt at first, feeling anything other than numb. But she had been so patient, so encouraging, that I was now a completely different man standing in our house than I had been just a year ago. This man smiled. This man admired the cheesy decorations and noticed the craftsmanship of the old ones. This man was a happy man, and it was all because of her. Whether it had been Christmas or really any other time of the year, she was my angel. This man would gladly join her in her tradition, now that her home was now his. So he had gladly helped her haul up the heavy boxes from the basement and deposit them around the living room. After it lit the fireplace and placed the mandatory mugs of cocoa safely outside the way, we had gotten to work. She had tasked me first with putting up the Christmas tree, which I had rarely done in my life, but it wasn't easy to riddle it out. I was the taller of the two of us, so it was no surprise that she had insisted. The artificial branches had been crippled, twisted on their sturdy wires for the process of being folded to its box, and I was struggling, unfolding them to look more natural. My hands and fingers were being slightly scraped and irritated from the synthetic needles, but I was not about to complain. I had finally managed to wrestle out the branches on all sides of that infernal thing into a something full-bodied, natural tree state, and stood back to examine my work. As I did, my eyes strayed over to her, my angel, still kneeling and gingerly placing the breakable little buildings of the village. When her mother had gifted the set to her, she had also given up the log mirror on which she'd set it up, with the lengths of puffy cottons to simulate snow. She had set it up every year since childhood, and so she knew it by heart, but to arrange each building in relation to another atop of the mirror. It was like watching art as her nimble fingers lifted the buildings, placed them, and turned them just so on the cotton. It was a very cute little set, but I doubt I would have noticed had she not been set before it. Even in a room filled with beautiful, eye-catching decorations and frills, she was by far the one who shined brightest. She wore no makeup and had her hair pulled back from her face, with a big red bow adorning her ponytail. Little holly berries and leaves shrouded from the bow, along with tiny golden bells. She was wearing an almost eye-watering, brightly red and green sweater. She had bought it on a sale last year, and hadn't had the chance to wear it before now. She had been so excited to pull it out that she hadn't even bothered to wash it first, and still smelled mildly like starch and seitan. The fit on her was bulky and loose, but that only had the effect of making her even more irresistibly huggable than she was on a regular basis. So much so that I've been having difficulty concentrating on my task when my eyes kept drifting to her. She was reaching for the very bottom of the box, for the next styrofoam-encased building. The box still retained its original glossiness after all these years, though the sides and corners were dented and worn. As she pulled out the last piece, she looked up, presumably checking on my progress, and caught me staring at her. There was a flash of mild surprise in her eyes, before she gave me a knowing smile. My cheeks heated briefly as she returned the smile, though mine probably looked far goofier than my angel's. She rolled those eyes slightly and gestured me to plug in the cord leading to the base of the tree. It was one of those pre-lit ones that was supposed to save time, stringing up separate strings of lights. I was so relieved when I plugged in the cord and all the lights thankfully sprang to life. I knew those pre-lit trees didn't always work so smoothly. As the lights blinked on, I saw Koji, her cat, jerked his head up and stared with wide, feline eyes at the four-eyed wonder now sitting in his living room. He was a young cat. We've brought him home from a shelter a few months ago, and he had never seen the likes of a Christmas tree before. All things considered, he was adjusting well to the sudden influx of boxes and new fixtures being put up around his house. I felt honored and he was allowing us to do as we pleased without causing a fuss or hiding fear. So far, he'd only mostly look up to observe each new item before going right back to meticulously grooming himself and pretending it was of no concern to him. Though the interest he might take in the dangling ornaments down the line was definitely something we were hoping to avoid. We had no choice but to hope he would ignore them and the tree entirely. The last thing we would want was for him to treat the tree as a brand new climbing and scratching post. Koji titled his head as my sweet angel scratched his chin with her cranberry red nails, purring so loudly that I could hear him even across the room. She apparently didn't feel like stopping her adoration at just a few scratches, and carefully picked up Koji and crowded him close, cooing to him. I took a short distraction to retrieve my mug from the end of the table and take a long sip. My angel made the best hot chocolate, and I had awoken to the rich scent of it earlier in the morning, as she had been heating it on the stovetop. I couldn't even remember any cocoa on my previous winters other than cheap powdered chocolate mixed with lukewarm milk. She even made something so simple as a new revelation. I walked over to give Koji a scratch and turn, and he stretched his arms to climb on the half of my shoulder. He apparently decided that he would rather climb on her rather than be cuddled. I couldn't really understand his logic, but then it was probably more complicated than us human owners could ever comprehend. So, my angel bent up the waist and let Koji climb on her back, like she was another piece of furniture. He looked entirely assured that this was well within his rights to literally walk all over her, but I had to show him his place once in a while, so I scooped him up with my free hand and lightly dropped him on the sofa cushions. He looked slightly annoyed with me before he leapt down and paddled out of the room. I assumed we were taking enough of his allotted time for us that morning. My angel smiled and jokingly said that I saved her, leaning up to plant a kiss on my lips that tasted of chocolate, peppermint, and delight. I kissed her back, wrapping an arm around her and pulling her to lean against me for a moment, enjoying the warmth of her body and the cedar scent of her garish Christmas sweater. We stood there briefly, staring at the boxes still littering the living room. One of them was overflowing with a length of galette. Another had a tangle of Christmas lights still waiting to be tested. Yet another held the Christmas plushies and pillows and figures to dot around the house. And laying on a chair amongst it all rested the little plastic bag with our own ornaments, just waiting for their turn. We had much to do, but we were in no hurry to finish the job. This was the kind of work that was much more about the experience rather than the end result. Both were beautiful and worthy of being treasured. And I had planned on waiting until everything was perfect, until the tree was decorated and the mantel lit with candles, the Christmas village glowing with artificial light, and the boxes packed away. But feeling her leaning against me, hugging me close, and humming in contentment and excitement, the timing seemed too perfect to pass it up. I wanted to show her just how far she had helped me come from my past, how grateful I was for her smiling presence and positive influence. Even if we had never become an item and had gone our separate ways, she would have set me on a brighter path. Just meeting her would have been enough to motivate me to see life the way she did. And so, discreetly, I leaned to pull my Coco aside under the guise of wrapping her in both my arms. While I had her invested in the hug, I reached into my pocket. And when I next kissed her, gently, I stood back, held her eyes. She knew at once I was up to something. I could tell by how she tilted her head slightly. I must have had a mischievous look about me, though, to be honest, I was feeling more racked by nerves and anticipation rather than mischief. My knees felt like water when I slowly backed away from her, still holding her gaze, and began lowering myself to the ground. I saw her expression change from one to shock and disbelief once I knelt on one knee only and presented her the ring that I had chosen weeks before. It wasn't overly fancy, and I was prepared to have it altered or even return it if she didn't like the design. But by the way she clapped her hands over her mouth and began crying, I had the feeling that the look of the ring was the last finger of mine. My heart thudded so strongly in my chest that I had to take a few ragged breaths myself, waiting for her response. She couldn't seem to get the words out for a few seconds, and she was gasping and wiping her tears, but she was smiling through them, and that gave me the answer before her quivering voice did. I could barely make out the word yes, but then she repeated over and over and over, through her thick tears and almost manic giggling, making sure that I knew her answer. My hands shook as I stood up again and carefully slipped the simple ring around her finger. She proceeded to stare at me in happy astonishment and continued to giggle and cry in turns before she let me hold her again and kiss her deeply. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Koji prowling back into the room, looking at the both of us with detached feline curiosity. Nothing insignificant would escape his observation, and he leapt up on the back of the sofa and let out a loud meow that I had decided to take as congratulations. Aside from the cat's approval, the relief that washed over me was enough to help the trembling nerves still making my limbs shake. My angel had said yes. She was mine, and I was hers. We would commit our lives to each other. She had taken me with all my baggage and scars. In spite of it all, loved me enough to keep me. Now, I would be there for her, always, to give her as much love, support, and understanding as she had given me, because she had said yes. And so, we stood there, arms around each other, quietly crying and laughing, listening to the music that had been replicated and played year after year for generations, surrounded by old memories, and laying the groundwork for all the future ones we would create together.